The post-war world was not built on goodwill. It was built on presence. For 8 decades, American power did not just project force. It embedded itself in rules, institutions, and routines that made the system feel stable, even fair. And then, quietly, that presence began to recede. On the 7th of January 2026, Washington withdrew from 66 international organizations and treaties in one stroke: climate, health, development, human rights. Not with a speech, not with a crisis, just an executive order. The message was unmistakable. Global cooperation is optional. Sovereignty comes first. You might think this is an American story. It is not. Because when the principal architect of the system steps back, the shock waves do not stop at its borders. They travel fast across the Indo-Pacific, into Southeast Asia, into the rules that smaller states rely on to survive asymmetry. If you want to understand what is really changing in this region, stay with me. Because to grasp the impact, we first need to be clear about what just broke and why it mattered in the first place. What broke was not a single treaty or budget line. What broke was an assumption. For decades, Southeast Asia operated on a quiet premise that great powers might compete, but they would do so inside a shared framework. Institutions absorbed shocks, rules slowed escalation, presence created predictability. ASEAN's centrality, fragile but functional, depended on that logic. The US retreat punctures it. When Washington labels multilateral institutions redundant or incompatible with sovereignty, it does more than exit rooms. It signals that rules are conditional, that commitments last only as long as domestic politics allow. For regions built on hedging rather than choosing sides, this is destabilizing. Southeast Asia does not rely on power projection. It relies on process, on meetings, norms, dispute mechanisms, and the quiet legitimacy that comes when the strongest actor shows up consistently. Remove that anchor, and the system does not collapse overnight, but it loosens. Influence begins to flow differently, forums matter less, bilateral leverage matters more, and the balance tilts toward those with weight, not rules. To see why this matters so deeply, we have to step back into history and understand why American power was embedded this way to begin with. This architecture did not emerge by accident. After 1945, the United States made a strategic choice to bind its power into institutions rather than wield it nakedly. The United Nations, Bretton Woods, the global trade regime. These were not acts of altruism. They were instruments. By embedding itself in rules, Washington amplified its influence. Smaller states gained voice and predictability. The system felt legitimate, not imposed. And in return, American leadership became durable. This bargain power, restrained by process, defined the post-war order. Even when the US acted unilaterally, it rarely abandoned the architecture entirely. Withdrawals were selective, temporary, reversible. The scaffolding remained standing. What makes the current retreat different is its scope. The review now reaches almost every treaty and organization on the books, including those central to climate governance and global health. The message is not reform, it is disengagement. For Southeast Asia, this history matters. The region prospered not because it was powerful, but because the system reduced vulnerability. When that system thins, old asymmetries resurface, and the consequences are no longer theoretical. They arrive first where coordination matters most. Climate is where abstraction turns into crisis. The United States was not just a participant in global climate governance. It was an engine, central to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, a driver of the Paris Agreement, and, critically, a major source of funding and momentum. When that engine shuts down, the system does not glide. It stutters. The numbers matter. The US accounted for over a quarter of assessed climate-related contributions across UN bodies. Its exit does not simply remove money. It removes political cover. Large emitters now have an excuse to slow down, to wait, to defect quietly. For Southeast Asia, this is a direct hit. Rising seas threaten Vietnam's delta. Extreme heat strains Indonesian cities. Food insecurity looms across the Philippines. These are not distant forecasts. They translate into projected GDP losses of several percentage points annually by mid-century. Multilateral climate finance was designed to blunt exactly this shock. Without US participation, the burden shifts unevenly onto those least able to carry it. If this matters to you, don't look away. Pay attention to what follows. Because climate is only the first rupture. Health security comes next, and it may arrive faster. What links climate, health, and development is not ideology. It is infrastructure. Multilateral institutions work because they pool risk, information, and resources across borders. They turn shared vulnerability into coordinated action. When the largest funder exits, the mechanism does not fail dramatically. It degrades quietly. Take health security. The US withdrawal from the World Health Organization removes its single largest donor at a moment when pandemic preparedness remains unfinished. During COVID-19, Southeast Asia benefited from WHO coordination on surveillance, vaccines, and data sharing. That coordination reduced uncertainty. It bought time. Now the incentives shift. According to Chatham House, other donors, unsettled by US disengagement, are already trimming contributions. The funding gap widens, surveillance weakens, data fragments. The next outbreak does not need to be deadlier, only faster. This is the hidden mechanism. Exit by a hegemon changes the behavior of everyone else. It signals that cooperation is fragile, that long-term investment may not be rewarded. Institutions become thinner not because they are abolished, but because confidence drains away. And when confidence drains, power fills the space. This brings us to the strategic consequences where withdrawal stops being bureaucratic and starts becoming geopolitical. When rules thin, leverage thickens. The US retreat does not announce a new order, it creates a vacuum. And in international politics, vacuums rarely stay empty. Influence flows toward those willing to fund, convene, and stay. China understands this instinctively. It already contributes roughly 15% of the UN's regular budget and is the largest peacekeeping funder among the Permanent Security Council members. Through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and Belt and Road projects, alternatives to US-backed finance are not hypothetical. They are operational. This is not a morality play. Chinese leadership does not automatically mean stability, nor does it guarantee coercion. But the shift itself is destabilizing. When multilateral forums weaken, bargaining moves into bilateral space. Deals become sharper. Power weighs heavier. For Southeast Asian states, this is the second crisis. Not collapse, but compression. Fewer buffers, less room to hedge, more pressure to align quietly, incrementally, but persistently. The danger is not sudden domination. It is normalization. A world where influence is exercised without referees, and that world does not hit abstractions first. It hits people. For you, this shift is not theoretical. It shows up in higher food prices when heat destroys crops, in longer recovery times after floods, in health systems that strain faster when the next virus crosses a border before data does. These are not failures of effort. They are failures of coordination. Southeast Asia has always lived with risk. What made it manageable was shared capacity, early warning systems, pooled funding, predictable rules. When those thin out, the costs land closer to home and sooner. You feel it when adaptation money arrives late, when vaccines are negotiated country by country, when smaller states are asked to carry risks once spread across many. The burden shifts quietly but relentlessly onto ordinary lives. This is where multilateralism stops being an elite conversation and becomes personal. Because when cooperation weakens, inequality deepens. Those with options move first. Those without absorb the shock. If this resonates, don't just watch. Stay engaged. Share this. Because the consequences don't stop at national borders. They ripple outward globally. The global system feels this retreat not as a break, but as a drag. Across the Indo-Pacific, uncertainty compounds. Climate commitments wobble. Health surveillance fragments. Development finance becomes more transactional. Each shift alone is manageable. Together, they alter the strategic weather. Japan and the European Union move to stabilize funding gaps, but coordination is harder without Washington anchoring the table. Middle powers step forward, yet none can replace the scale or signaling power of the United States. The result is not multipolar balance, but institutional fatigue. Geopolitically, this matters. Weaker rules push competition into infrastructure, technology standards, and security partnerships. Influence spreads through supply chains and financing terms, not treaties. And as cooperation becomes selective, trust erodes. For Southeast Asia, the danger is entanglement. Global rivalries seep into domestic choices. Ports, energy grids, data networks become sites of quiet contest. Without strong multilateral buffers, every decision carries heavier strategic weight. This is how global shifts become local constraints. And once constraints tighten, the future stops being linear. It fractures into scenarios. There are three paths ahead, not predictions, but pressures. The first is resilience. Southeast Asia adapts. ASEAN deepens coordination on climate resilience and health security. Partners like Japan, the EU, and Australia invest more deliberately in institutions, not just projects. Multilateralism survives leaner but intact, held together by those who still believe rules are cheaper than rivalry. The second is drift. Institutions persist in name, but hollow out in practice. Funding is patchy, commitments are selective. Cooperation becomes episodic. This is not collapse, it is erosion. The third is fragmentation. Power politics fully reassert themselves. Climate action splinters. Health responses nationalize. Development finance hardens into spheres of influence. Smaller states face sharper choices with fewer exits. None of these futures is predetermined. All are shaped by who shows up, who funds, and who stays when cooperation becomes slow and unglamorous. History suggests great powers often return to the tables they abandon, usually after crises prove unmanageable alone. Until then, the Indo-Pacific enters a thinner world. Absence is never neutral. When a great power steps back, it rewrites incentives. Funding decisions change. Risks are repriced. Cooperation becomes conditional. And slowly, the work of holding power in check gets harder. For Southeast Asia, the lesson is stark. The future will not be decided only by who is strongest, but by who is willing to stay, to invest, to coordinate, to defend rules when they are inconvenient. For Australia, this moment is clarifying. Assuming automatic US leadership is no longer enough, the task now is to convene, to invest, and to argue relentlessly that cooperation is not weakness, but strategy. And for you, watching this unfold, the choice is not passive. These systems endure only when they are understood, defended, and demanded. History tells us power often returns to the tables. It abandons, but only after damage is done. Until then, the Indo-Pacific lives with fewer guardrails. And in geopolitics, what is removed is often felt more sharply than what remains.